And today we're going to be talking about Christian sexual ethics. So this will be the first of a three-part series in which we're going to be covering, as the title implies, sexual ethics and why they're important, how do we respond to criticisms, and so on. With today, we're kind of just going to set up our foundation because if we're going to talk about this topic, we have to make sure that we even understand what we're trying to argue for, what we're not trying to argue for, um, what are we actually even talking about, why it matters, etc. So basically, most of today is just going to be from a Christian perspective. There's no going to be like arguments back and forth. That's going to be done primarily the second and third day. And then, so not next days, but weeks. So starting with that, I think we first have, when we're talking about ethics, which is ultimately what we're talking about, right? We have to recognize that within the Christian worldview, ethics are in many ways primarily based on purpose. And by deriving the purpose on something, or not deriving it, but figuring out the purpose of something, we then figure out the ethics for it. This is fundamental in Christian ethics, and it's also fundamental in most other ethical systems. So when we look at that, we look at, okay, so what does the Bible actually tell us the purpose is? Since obviously that's God's way of telling us very explicitly what it is. And we have basically 5 main things. One, it's primarily for intimacy, which is something that a pastor I was talking to brought up to me that I didn't really think about, which is, because we've only grown up in this world, right? We only think of like, oh, this is the only way things could be. Or something he pointed out to me is like, we think, oh, well, reproduction has to be this way. But of course, God could have made it that we were like mitochondria and we just had clones that just appeared out of us, right? Like mitosis. Or we could have been like plants. But obviously, God decided to design us this way, and he did it for a purpose. And one of those is through intimacy, which is obviously pretty clear. Another way is holiness and obedience. Now, if we look in 1 Corinthians 6:19 through 20, we're told that our bodies are a temple for the Holy Spirit, and that because of that, we also are supposed to live in sexual purity. So, by utilizing our desires in their proper context, as God has defined, we are then honoring them and honoring God. Or honoring ourselves and honoring, by extension, also honoring God. Because after all, he has given us these bodies, and so we should be respectful for how we use them. The other part is for straight up human flourishing. Obviously, you can't have kids any other way. And so making sure that we are using our sexual desires in a proper context increases human flourishing overall, primarily for kids. Like divorce. There it is. That's the word I was missing my I's and my E's. I was like, what the heck am I missing? In divorce, right? That's massively negatively impact our culture.
Sophie, sorry, are you on the second slide or the first slide?
I'm on the second.
Okay, we can only see the first slide.
Now,
right. Now it's the second. Oh, now it's the second. Whatever you're doing, you're switching back and forth.
Yeah, I think I know why. I'm just gonna have it share the screen instead of trying to. How are we looking now?
Now we see the second. This was great.
Awesome.
Thanks. Okay, keep going. I'll field questions.
Yeah. So anyways, so when we don't use it in its proper context, we end up with a lot of negative repercussions that end up hurting both ourselves, people around us, and also God, because we're not honoring his creation. Now, the fourth one is that it is a representation of Christ's love. As we know, or as it's stated multiple times in the New Testament, Christ's love for us is often shown through marriage. And so recognizing that as well. And when we look at how Paul talks about wife and husband and how, don't you know, like, your body's not your own. It was bought with a price. Like, the husband has the wife, and then the wife has the husband body, and you're both in control of each other. That's also very important. And then also we have the sanctity of life, mainly in regards to things like abortion, taking care of children. And when we don't use our sexual desires in the proper context, this often ends up negatively affecting these. For example, right, you have things like polygamy, which negatively affects both the wife and children, since obviously the man is then not spending time with those other kids, and he's also splitting his attention between people. And then you have these women who are vying for attention for the husband, which is not proper. Going on from there. So something I think some people say is, well, isn't it obvious? Well, according to this is the research I'm about to cite right now comes from Pew Research, and I might actually bring up some more stuff from Pew Research because I thought it was pretty interesting because I was looking at it this morning. And what I found is that out of religious teens overall, so I believe this includes not just Christians, includes Muslims, Hindus, blah. 49% of them said that living together was perfectly okay for marriage. 51% of evangelical millennials believe that same-sex behavior is morally acceptable. And actually, I was looking at the study today, and it found that out of self-fulfilling Christians, roughly 50-50 percent of Christians approved same-sex marriage versus disapproved same-sex marriage. Now, it is important to note that when I was going through the study, I also looked at, they broke down the percentages of, do you go to church regularly? Do you pray often? And what I found is, realistically, if we're looking at people who go to church regularly, the percentage is probably closer to about 25% approve versus 75% disapprove. And also, as Mikey said, Reb, I'll be talking about that a little bit next week, and then some in the third week. But again, the primary point of this is primarily for Christians, trying to understand what the Christian worldview is, and then later on going into how you argue for it. Let's see. And then I think this statistic actually probably shocked me the most, though it makes a lot of sense when you look at the numbers, which is that about 70% of women have had an abortion, identify as Christian, and 43% attend church at least once per month. So when I say isn't it obvious, it's not to say like, oh, all these people are just dumb or something. But what it is to say is that, again, Rad, if you want to get into this discussion, you're going to have to just wait a second and let us talk about it. We can go through this, and then if you want to debate it, we can debate it later, but this is not the appropriate time. So the main reason why I especially brought up the last statistic is that you can't just assume everyone around you has the same ideas, same thought patterns, or grew up the faith, believe this stuff. And also shows that you do have to be sensitive when you're talking about these topics and making sure that you're not assuming things about people that may or may not be true. Now, and talking about like, why does it matter? Well, from a Christian perspective, here are some primary reasons why it matters. So in 1 Corinthians 6:18-20, it says, flee sexual, and this is from the CSB, flee sexual immorality. For every sin a person commits is outside the body, but the person who is sexually immoral sins against his own body. Don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought at a price, so glorify God with your body. Now, sort of to put this in context, when Paul is writing to the Corinthians church was suffering from some pretty bad issues, as you know if you read the letters. And mainly in part because of the location and the culture. So the culture of Corinth, they had a saying that went something along the lines of basically everything's legal in Corinth. It was almost an equivalent to something like how we say, like, anything that anything that happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It was kind of like that, but with Corinth. And so, as you can imagine, a culture like that is going to have a lot of these issues that are going on. And that is sort of the context for which Paul is then writing this to the church. Now, again, if we look at also Ephesians 5-3, we see, but sexual immorality and any impurity or greed should not be heard of among you, as is proper for the saints. So again, writing to the Ephesians, hey, like sexual morality is not proper for the saints. This isn't something we should strive toward. We should strive for something far better than this. Now, if we look at 1 Thessalonians 4:3-5, for this is God's will, your sanctification, that you keep away from sexual immorality, that each of you knows how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not with lustful passions like the Gentiles who don't know God. And so the point of bringing up these 3 verses, like, hey, here's what the Bible says on it. Obviously, as Christians, we believe that the Bible is holy inspired. And so we should be looking at, like, are we trying to take our cultural understandings and then apply them to the text? Or are we actually looking at the text and then having it shape us as it should be? Because I've seen a couple of times at different churches where people try to twist things. They try to take their own modern understanding and be like, well, actually, blah, blah, blah doesn't really mean this. And it's like, well, if you look at the culture and if you look at the context for it, actually it does. And so then the question becomes, are we going to allow ourselves to be like, I don't like this part about the Bible, so I'm just going to ignore it? Or are we going to let the Bible transform us through the Holy Spirit, which is ultimately what sanctification is about? And so going on to another reason why it matters is one of the negative consequences of sexual sin is that it doesn't just affect you, it also affects others. And I think one of the most explicit ways this is true is in the case of abortion. This was just some research I found. I forget who exactly conducted it. Oh, it says right at the bottom. And again, as it says, roughly 98,000 people were killed every single month, due in part to a sexual sin. Now, obviously, there's more to it, right? You can theoretically sexually sin and not have this happen. But it is true that, people talk about, unpregnant pregnancies. Well, if you have sex with someone, there's always a chance of pregnancy. And for many people who find themselves in that circumstance, a good percentage of them just decide to end the life of another human being in order to not have to deal with that consequence, which is obviously horrific and pretty damning to the American country overall. Now, obviously, I've gone through a couple slides so far. Does anyone have any questions they want to talk about before we move on?
No, I don't have any.
So I'm going to talk about the Book of Numbers because I actually know this. The Book of Numbers. So the ritual they often talk about is there's a ritual mentioned by in Numbers where if there's suspect of adultery, they'll give the woman this serum thing. And the idea is God will pass judgment, and if she was adulterous, her womb would shrivel up, and if she hasn't, then nothing will happen. Now, what's important to note about this is 2 primary things. 1, this ritual could not be performed with someone who is pregnant. Let me make that clear again. The rule was you could not perform it with someone pregnant, meaning this is not about abortion. What it was about is that the womb would be shriveled up, meaning the person could not have another kid. That is what it's about. It is absolutely not in support of abortion. And if you look at the early church fathers, you find, because something I should know is sometimes people think like, abortion just happened like 2 seconds ago. Infanticide has been a thing for all of human history. And when you look at the early church fathers, they are very explicitly condemning infanticide that is being performed in Rome at the time. So it definitely cannot be supported. And again, Numbers does not support this. It's a very modern interpretation to try to interpret it that way, but that is not what it's intended about. But rape and incest. Well, so the question would be, what biblical principles approve of that? There just isn't any. I mean, those two are horrible things, and let me make it very clear: no one here is in support of either of those. Like, I am full blown death penalty. I don't care about the scum like that. But you don't just get to murder an innocent person because of that. And it's not saying that like this is your perspective that you're like doing this, but I do think it is kind of insulting to say that people conceived that way are just like basically not human. That, you know, everyone else is allowed to live, but, you know, them, do they have a right to life? Well, I don't know. And and again, I'm not saying that's from your perspective, obviously. Try not to sound super harsh. I'm more just talking about people who generally have seen use the argument. But we have to remember, like, we are talking about human beings. Human beings, by the way, made in the image of God himself. So, like, pretty serious matter.
Chelsea, what is this chart showing again, real quick?
What?
What is this chart showing?
Could you repeat, Mikey? Because
what is the chart showing here?
Okay, so the chart is just showing the number of abortions performed per year in America. Sorry, I removed some of the title because it was they actually didn't have that in the title. I should have clarified.
Yeah. Okay. No problem.
Now, in regard to incest, again, it's pretty insulting to say that you should just kill disabled people because they're going to live a hard life.
Yeah. Let's not.
That's just straight up eugenics. Like, you're arbitrarily deciding someone's existence is going to be worse or best, and so you're going to artificially choose for them to, like, kill them. Which is actually something that is performed in, I believe it's Denmark. Denmark pretty famously cured Down syndrome. There's only, I believe, one person with Down syndrome in all of Denmark. And I might have messed with the country.
They cured it.
And they cured it by killing. It was Iceland. Thank you. And they killed everyone that they heavily encouraged people to kill their babies if they were going to have Down syndrome.
Terrible.
And yeah, I just find it rather strange how the solution is not, hey, how can we make these people's lives better? It's like, well, they're going to cost us resources. Their life is going to be not as good as mine, so we might as well just, you know.
What if they did that on people that were genetically disposed to addiction, or genetically disposed to depression, or genetically disposed to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It would be shocking.
And by the way, these are not like crazy ideas. This was commonly talked about in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Yeah. Like, this was full blown being suggested by doctors.
Yeah.
Pretty famously, the founder of Planned Parenthood placed abortion centers in black neighborhoods because she thought the black species was inferior and that it was best that they kill themselves. Because they were quote unquote inferior genetic. So, again, I'm not saying you believe this, Reb. Like, these are good questions to ask. And again, I hope I'm not coming off as like I'm personally accusing you of this. I'm just trying to put in proper perspective, like, hey, this is what we're talking about. Because I do feel like a lot of times the issue can be kind of obfuscated in wordplay and rhetoric that is not particularly helpful. Yeah, I was being very sarcastic. Sorry, my New England sarcasm sometimes doesn't come through very well. But I do think it's important that we don't get too hung up on this debate. As much as I love debate, and I'm happy to get into the debate channel and talk about this. But obviously, we do have other slides to get through, and I think it's really important we get through them so that way we can set up the next couple weeks, if that's okay with everyone.
Yeah, let's keep going. Reb, if you have further questions and stuff, let's not have them in the channel. Do you know the debate channel? Oh, okay. So post here your questions and people can go there and debate them. But let's try to stay focused on this awesome presentation that Sophie has.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so again, I mainly brought this up because I think this is a very clear indicator of like, hey, this is something that can actually happen. Like, we're talking about actual human lives right now. And so we have to recognize that sometimes we might think like, oh, well, this is only affecting me, so it's not that big of a deal. Well, no, you actually are affecting other people. And even if you're not, by the way, just sinning against yourself is egregious anyways. Because again, you were bought with a price, and you're ignoring that fact basically when you sin against yourself. And I'm really going to get into this next week when we talk about the book Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey, because she really digs deep into this stuff. So, we said this, a lot of condemnation, right? Like, let's go back, Corinthians, like, flee sexual immorality, don't you know that you're sinning against God? You should be pure. And yes, she is based. Sometimes we can get really caught up in the condemnation, and it can be pretty crippling to us. I know some people I've talked to have been like, I thought, well, I'm already this far deep, so I might as well just kind of give up. But I think what we have to remember is Christianity is not just about that. It's also about the forgiveness of Jesus, which is as important as the condemnation. And some verses that I thought was important because you find them within the same context of the others is Ephesians 2:8-9. For you are saved by grace through faith. This is not from yourself. It is God's gift, not from works, so that no one can boast. And I think a lot of us, I know especially for me, I try to work my way into solving a problem. And, sometimes that just doesn't work. You can't just, no matter how strong your will is, it has a limit. And so that's why it's so important to remember that we have the Holy Spirit and that we should be seeking to be more indwelled by it. That way he may change us himself rather than us trying to change ourselves. Hopefully that made sense. I feel like I got kind of word salary, kind of tripped over my words a little bit, but and the second verse I want to go to is in 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, and see, the new has come. Just remembering that, our old selves die ultimately at the cross, and that Jesus raises us as a new creation, even in the current life. Now, going from there, I think it is, again, important to mention, like, hey, God made this act for a reason. And he didn't declare it bad. Okay? In the Garden of Eden, one of the curses listed ain't that like, oh, well, now you have to reproduce this way. No, it was like that from the beginning. And it was like that for a reason. And so sometimes you hear in conversations like, oh, well, you just think it's ugly and blah, blah, blah. And I do think you get a lot of that from some churches, at least some of the churches I've been to, where it's such a taboo topic. It's not like, oh, well, we should only talk about this in mature settings. It's like so taboo that it's like, we'll just pretend that it doesn't exist. It's like, well, hold on a second. God made it for a purpose, and we should be trying to figure out how we can best utilize it to honor God. And we quite literally have a whole book based on it. Song of Solomon, especially if you understand the historical context around the metaphors and stuff, is kind of explicit, just straight up. and there's a reason why it's there, and we should be trying to figure out, why God put it there and how we can then use it to transform our lives. Now getting into probably one of the more prolific sexual sins in our society, which affects everyone, Christian and not, is obviously porn, which has massively been ramped up with the age of the internet. According to Common Sense Media, they found that the average age of introduction is between 12 and 15. I've seen it as low, so I was looking around at different statistics. I have seen it as low as 10 to 8. I said that a little backwards, but either way, which is pretty horrifying. And yeah, I think this is one that a lot of people can feel like they're trapped in for a very long time. And it's something that, yeah, and we do have ministries on our Discord to help deal with this. But yeah, it's pretty bad. And the problem is, as people using it at younger ages, it's probably just going to decrease. I mean, I can barely use some websites without just being shoved all over the place. It's absolutely ridiculous. So we're talking about some of the effects. Here's just some effects. One we've noticed based on brain studies, etc. It's basically the same thing as a drug addiction, which kind of makes sense. You would imagine that most addiction is going to function pretty similarly. Some have compared it, say it's kind of like heroin in terms of its effective addiction level or addictive qualities, which is pretty awful. And again, it also has negative effects in terms of your spiritual health, right? Like, it's obviously very shameful. It causes you to have a much lower self-image, as you have a lower self-image of other people. And anyone who's obviously dealt with it knows how awful of an experience it is. Yeah, you're right, Halvin. There's a lot of it on TV as... I mean, it's interesting. To a certain extent, some of it does seem to be that rules seem to be getting slightly laxer over time. Though you can find semblance of it in 90s and 80s and so on. I think what's really changed is just as more people spend more time online, it then basically just gets more attention. And so, talking about that, I originally actually had this titled, battling porn, but I changed sexual sin because I realized that a lot of this stuff is stuff that applies to all facets of sexual sin and really sin in general. Now, obviously, the first one is, the renewal of the mind. I was actually reading what is it called? A devotional something that talked about this, bringing up Romans 12:2, which, remember that Paul says, our minds are transformed by the Holy Spirit and are renewed through it. Our second one is fleeing temptation. If you know something like, oh, this is going to cause me to sin, hey, I shouldn't be in this circumstance. I remember there was pretty famously about 7 years ago, at the time, Vice President Mike Pence, he had done an interview with someone, and the president asked him about all kinds of stuff. And he basically talks about like, oh, well, I will never be in a room by myself with another woman who's not my wife. Or I won't go to dinner with another one without my wife being there. And I remember the hubbub this caused. Oh my goodness, this was on the news for like a week. I was talking about like, oh, this crazy man. Oh, what is he worried about? What is he gonna do? Like, oh wow, you really require your wife to be there just to keep the up and up? All this crazy nonsense. But I think something that's important, that a good lesson taught out of that was he was setting up a clear boundary because he recognized the frailty of himself. And I'm sure some of it also had to do with reputation, because, people can lie and all this stuff. But also, again, recognizing, hey, this could be a weakness, and so I'm going to not put myself in that weakness. Sure, it may not be sinful necessarily, but I'm going to set up this fence away from the edge so that way I'm not just tiptoeing over it. You know, if you imagine like you have a cliff face, right? And if you put up a fence, you probably shouldn't put the fence up right on the cliff face. Why? Because there's not a lot of support there. You know, you lean on the fence and suddenly you're falling over the cliff. You know, you should set it away from it so that way you don't even have to worry about being near it. Now, obviously, this can be abused, as some different denominations have. But just because it's been abused doesn't mean that, therefore, you shouldn't have any fence at all. That's sort of the short of it. Yes, it will be all of this will be recorded. Basically, Mange will edit the beginning and the end just so that way there's not a whole lot of nothing. And then it will be immediately posted in the social media stuff of Christian Influence. So yeah, again, flee temptation. And I do like the word flee because it's not like it's not a passive verb. It's an active verb. You're actively avoiding, which I think is so incredibly important to remember instead of just being like, well, I'll just be very passive. Because when you're passive, it then opens you up. Because you're basically just trying to pull the will game, and the will game will never win for you. The third one is relying on the Spirit, right? So, as it says in Galatians, rely on the Holy Spirit when dealing with temptations. And I think that's incredibly important because, again, like you can imagine that you have the greatest will of any human being. You're like the David Goggins of wills. Completely unshakable, but chances are you probably aren't. And so you should rely on the Spirit instead of trying to rely on yourself, since the Spirit is God. The fourth one, which I think is pretty important to remember, especially in Protestant circles, at least non-Anglican circles, Protestant non-Anglican, because the Anglicans do this, but is remembering that we actually should confess and repent for God, and also just finding someone who can, as the next one is, seeking accountability, someone who you can be accountable to and confess to is massively important and helpful in helping deal with the struggle. And so whether that be finding a pastor, a trusted friend, or whatnot, obviously it's awkward and obviously it sucks, but I think it's really important and can have a transformable effect on you. Let's see. So, does anyone have any questions about these past two slides before I move on? Yeah, it's everyone imagines that they have indomitable will until they're put into a circumstance. Kind of like everyone thinks, oh, if I was in a self-defense situation, I would just, I don't know, I would just see red and just, I don't know, be like Captain America or something. But you really never know unless you're in that circumstance. And it's better to never know than to artificially test yourself. Because again, how often do we have to see, for example, like pastors, right? How often do we have to see a pastor who runs into a controversy over this? And the reason why they run into controversy in this is because they didn't set up the proper barriers in place. This is obviously how a lot of pastors have had downfalls in the past. Well, forever, really, but especially in the modern era, seems to be. Also, kind of just something occurred to me reading your thing again, writer, about the personal choice and the respecting his wife. I had a teacher who was like this, and it blows my mind how many people are like, oh, you're just insecure, blah blah blah. No, it has nothing to do about security. It has to do with recognizing the human condition. Like, only an incredibly delusional person can think that, oh, well, under no circumstances could I possibly tempted to do something wrong. It has nothing to do with insecurity. It has entirely to do with an accurate representation of your own frailty, and then realizing, hey, I shouldn't put myself in that circumstance. And also, I think you should just not take advice from people who obviously fail at relationships, like my English teacher who was divorced 3 times. It always blew me away how often he would give advice.
Yeah, 3 times.
Yeah, it was he was a great teacher, but I'll admit, every time he would say something, I was like, I really don't think you should talk. You know, if I brought my car to the mechanic and they failed 3 times at fixing it, I'm not bringing it to them again. Call me crazy. And I think, again, like, I'm not going to say any super hard, fast rules because I do think it depends on the person. But I do think, hey, if you're going to make a rule, you have to recognize, like, hey, am I actually taking this seriously? Or if I'm kind of like, I'll be fine, you know? And also recognizing, like, hey, some of us might be stronger than others. Yeah, I have so going off what you say, Mikey. This is a completely personal opinion. Like, this is not okay. So we're gonna take off my representing Christian influence hat for a second. I think so. I have a couple female friends, and I know everyone's like, "Oh, really?" Like, actual, like, straight up, just friends.
What a simp.
But the reason
God.
why I consider friends is because from the get go, my mom was like, "Nah, never dating this person." Straight up. And then also setting up clear boundaries of like, hey, I would never do this with this person. Sure, I'll go out to eat with the boys. I am not taking someone to a restaurant who's a female friend. I don't know. I don't think that's that crazy.
I don't think it is either, Sophie.
And again, I know it depends on the person. So, for example, like I had a buddy, his family actually comes from the Philippines, and I guess in Filipino culture, there's less of a divide. It's more integrated, I guess. So he had quite a few female friends. We obviously we joked at his expense sometimes, but out of good faith. And so in that circumstance, I could see how that was slightly different from me because my cultural background and perspective was different from his perspective. But again, I have no problem. I think it's just so stupid how people will be like, "Hey, I'm just gonna set up this boundary. You know, this is what I think," and that people are like crazy offended by it. It's so stupid. And don't be publicly shamed into thinking otherwise. Who cares? The general public sucks. All of culture's got this all backwards. Just look at Andrew Tate and the rest. But besides that, again, if there's any questions, I'll answer them now and then we'll move on. Agreed. Manosphere culture sucks. At least the Tate side of it. And those other delusional pleasure obsessed men. I'll put men in quotation marks. Now, putting back on my Christian influence hat, we shall continue. So another big thing that Sophie is talking about, and I do think there's interesting debate on this. Not in the sense that I don't have a clear idea, but just that the Bible is definitely way less explicit about this. Unless I'm missing a verse, I couldn't find anything that was more specific, that was like very explicit on it. But there are definitely, I think, some principles that then lead us to the correct conclusion, which is, I think, hey, you shouldn't live together straight up before marriage. Some of those come from Ephesians 5:31 and Genesis 2:24, which very much emphasis that, hey, this is a sacred union that's separate from the rest. And it seems very clear in those circumstances, like, hey, they're moving in together once they're married. Because what was customary in Jewish culture, assuming my memory doesn't fail me, was that the man would go out and basically build a house. So you like find someone who's going to marry, be like, hey, father of person I'm going to marry, I want to marry her. And, the father and the husband, they figure this out. If they agree, whatever. And then the husband would go out, basically build a home. And then once the house is built, then you have the ceremony, then they're married, blah. Then you live together. And so obviously, you have to debate about, hey, how much of that's cultural versus, so basically descriptive versus prescriptive. But I do think it's anyways a good principle that, hey, we should probably, maybe you don't have to go and literally build your own home since pretty much no one does that these days, but you should probably, if you're going to live together, you should be married. And I think there's also two big other ones that I think if people are honest with themselves, will admit that these are also two pretty good reasons why you shouldn't. One is temptation. Like, again, if you're dating each other, assumedly, you find each other attractive. Wild stuff, I know. And if you do, and you're living together, and no one else is around, temptation is through the roof. Like, let's not kid ourselves here. Let's not delude ourselves into thinking that we are so far above this. But this should, again, be pretty obvious. And again, if we're trying to not run into temptation and sinning, putting yourself in a circumstance that's doing literally the exact opposite, not good. Yeah. Actually, helping you. Funny you say it. So, what was very common, back in, basically, I want to say pre-70s, mainly 80s, pre-80s, and so on, where things called shotgun marriages, where basically, you know what, they decided to do the act without getting married, and then they would basically get married immediately afterwards. And so you'd have like 8-month babies and stuff like that. That was also a pretty big thing. And honestly, I would take that over their current. Ideally would be, hey, you don't put yourself in that circumstance anyways, then you don't have this issue. But if you're in this circumstance, then I would definitely prefer that. Now, the final reason, and this one is actually pretty interesting because there's a lot of science to back this up, which is that if you're living together but you're not married, you're basically trying to have your cake and eat it too. You're trying to have all the advantages of marriage, but you're having none of the commitment. I remember watching a Brett Cooper video in which he was talking about all these people that were talking about what they call it, like the next girl or something. These people who were dating for super long times, they break up, and then the guy immediately marries like the next girl he finds. Now, it should be very clear that sinful. Like, don't do that. That's evil. Like, it's incredibly sinful to disrespect someone's time and give them the allure of commitment for years and then not follow through with it. But also, like, don't put yourself in that circumstance. Like, you have to take some agency in your life. Like, hey, I'm not going to try to, like, settle with someone who's going to give me the, I know. Wild stuff. I'm very controversial today. I'm not sure how much longer I can work at this establishment. But anyways, like, I don't know. To me, this just feels so obvious. Maybe it's because I'm a guy, and so like I look at a guy and I'm like, I know what you're thinking. But if you're a woman, like, there's absolutely no reason for why you should settle for this like non-committed relationship. And I don't care what kind of weird it is. I'm like, oh, well, we're actually committed. Unless you are married, you're not. Just straight up. If you're committed, you can't. If you can just immediately leave someone, I don't know how committed you are. Just call me crazy. And yeah, I have some Pew research on the side that sort of go into it. Now, it should be noted, this does not separate religious Christians and specifically dedicated religious Christians from everyone else. This is sort of just the general public. You take like 30,000 random people and then you go blah and then research. Yeah, I can't stand that next. That honestly, every time I hear that, part of me dies. And what blows me away is you have so many people. I like watching a lot of comedy specials, and they'll do crowd work, and you'll find these people that have been dating for like 1,000,000,001 years. And it's like, oh, we're so committed, blah blah. And it's like, then just get married. What are you waiting for? Like, oh, we're basically married. It's like, okay, well, you can remove the basically part and just be married. It's really not that hard. I probably shouldn't keep going because I'll go into an entire rant about modern marriage and how I think the whole system we have in America is so stupid. But I do not have any studies K-pop star. I I was gonna try to search for some, but I didn't want to. Yeah, it wasn't. I didn't want to do some like half baked research on it. In the book, Love Thy Body, I think she talks about it. Or I might be thinking about another book I have. But yeah, I didn't want to put any half-baked research, so I was like, you know what, I'll just grab some Pew research because Pew is reliable. Pew research is very good research. And I trust their stuff, and they make very nice graphs, like this. Yeah, I really much don't want to do half-baked research because nothing's worse than being like blatantly wrong and then misleading a bunch of people. So next thing you hear from some people, and this one actually drives me up the wall. Like this one makes me want to slap someone, just straight up. Is feel like, oh well, if we don't live together, how can we possibly know we want to marry the other person? Yeah. I haven't heard of the ACU. I'll have to check them out. Again, I'm familiar with Pew, but that's mainly because I have a politics background and everyone uses Pew in politics. Pew is like the quintessential golden standard when it comes to political research in polls and studies and stuff. Okay, I'll have to check them out. But yeah, going on again, you have something like, oh well, you just gotta. It's like a car. Okay, you gotta test drive the car, figure out if it works, figure out any flaws. You really only know someone when you're living together. Now, again, this one drives me up the wall because one, it's so degrading to the other person. Like it's literally textbook definition of dehumanization. Where you're just like, oh yes, this person, it's basically the same thing as a car. And it's like, well, no, it's basically not at all like a car. Okay, people and cars, not the same thing. One has moral worth, one does not have moral worth. Okay, you don't get to treat people made in the image of God like they're cars. That's wrong. Stop doing that. Stop it. Again, so man, people aren't tools. And when I'm talking about marriage, you'll get this in a lot of the MGTOW crowd, which is men going their own way, which is basically a lot of divorced dads. They're very angry, and some of the reasons are justified. Like the divorce system in America is pretty trash. But one thing you hear of these people and people like Tay is they'll just string marriage down. Oh well, it's just out of convenience. If it's convenient to get married, then I will, and if it's not, I won't. again, this is a whole, so at least on the Christian perspective, it is a holy institution. Okay? This isn't something you get to play around with. You don't get to try to loophole God. Okay? This is a divinely inspired and done institution that has rules, and you are morally obligated to abide by them. No two ways about it. Let's not split hairs. Ooh. Now you got me interested. K-pop star. I'll give you an email so you can send me some of these. Or actually, I guess I can see them so I can find them myself. Interesting. I got some U.S. Census stuff. Nice. Eurostat. Those are good websites. Anyways, before I get too distracted on studies, but which very easily distract me. Going on this again. You don't get to do this. That's wrong. And also, it's extremely selfish. What blows me away when I hear people talk about relationships, especially marriage and stuff, is how selfish people are. Oh my goodness. Hey, you'll listen to some random video on it by some other people. And it's like, all you hear is like, oh, well, but will this benefit me? Do I benefit from this? And it's like, what the heck is going on? What's up with all these me's and I's? Like, oh, well, she's going to use my money. And it's like, friggin', what's this my money about? There is no my money. It's our money. Like, stop it. Stop doing that. Like, oh my goodness. Like, oh, how did the marriage fail? I don't know. Maybe because you were so selfish. Yes. That'd be a great shirt. Don't call me a car. Might be very confusing, admittedly, for a lot of people. But yeah, I don't know. It blows my mind every time I listen to some random YouTube marriage video and the people are like by, the MG Tao guys or whatever, and just how self-centered it is. And it's like, do you think maybe your marriage failed because, I don't know, you played a role in it? Like, my goodness. Not every single person is like this witch, and you're just like the greatest saint to ever bless us. Oh yes. Oh, don't get me wrong. Next, definitely do not confuse me. I am not saying that only men can fail in any of these regards. Like women can 100% fail as too. I remember, back when I was probably late middle school, there was all these videos from women being like, "Oh, how to get," who are basically going on these dates just for food. Like that person is, trust me, sinning just as much as anyone else, and needs to repent of their sins. Because men are also made in the image of God. So, basically, long and short is just, hey, when you look at how love is described in the Bible, it's very explicit. It's not rocket science. It's like patience, don't be selfish, blah blah blah. And if you're failing at any of these, it shouldn't be a surprise that maybe other things are going to go wrong in your marriage. And also go to a pastor. Pastor is better than some random marriage counselor who got a degree and has like 3 divorces under their belt. Yeah, that was disgusting. I mean, to be fair, the internet does show us the worst of humanity. So I try to be optimistic. I really don't think most people are like that. I think what most people suffer from is hyper egotism. They think because we grow up in a culture that views the self so highly, people then forget that, hey, selfishness actually is wrong. And being self-centered and thinking like, oh, every institution should be designed to give me the greatest pleasure ever at the cost of anyone else is dumb. And again, I think you see it on both sides, right? So you see like the hyper independent feminists who's like, I don't need no man, and spout some random nonsense about marriage and how, I'm gonna do this and that, and it'll be, here's my money because he doesn't have any right to my money. And you got the men who are effectively the exact same thing. Like the dark secret for the Manosphere group, like all those Tate people, is that they're just feminists. They completely agree with feminists. It's just that instead of being on the female side and being like they're just on the men's side. They're the same people. They agree on everything. All their presuppositions are the same. Their diagnosis of issues is remarkably similar. It's just gross. Go to the Bible, not to Tate. Oh, no, next. You do not come off that way. Do not mistake me. And yeah, I mean, hurt sucks. That's definitely true. And again, you don't come off that way. At all. Like, it was good you brought it up, because I think we talked about some important stuff. Are there any questions, though, before we move on to the next slide? Awesome. So, moving on. Again, we kind of already talked about this, right? So, when I was doing some research, here were the top 5 reasons. I forget which research said this. Actually, let me see. Do I have it? Okay, I do. Sweet. So, this was a governmental website, and they did a survey, and these were the top 5 reasons. I believe top 5 reasons that were given for why people live together. One is straight up to hook up. Shocking to no one. The other one was to share expenses. So again, splitting bills and stuff like that. Spending time together. Again, testing relationship. Again, a lot of the test drive stuff. And then interesting enough, the fifth one they found was insecurities. So they found that a lot of people wanted to live together. It was basically they weren't secure in the relationship, so they kind of viewed it as a way of a quote unquote higher committed relationship, which is not really. So you also have that. Sort of moving on now onto our last topic today, and this is going to be next week. We'll kind of talk about this. We'll talk about this a little bit more, and then our third week we're going to be dealing with straight up just LGBTQ stuff. That's all it will be about. Now, when we look at the Bible, again, we have some more progressive churches that tend to teach otherwise, and they have their justifications for why their justifications are wrong. Yeah, I will say it's, if you look at the scholars, actual scholars, not just people with a political agenda that then try to read into the scholarship what's not there. The people that try to make it sound like Rome was this weirdly like hyper gay place. And all kinds of other not weird nonsense that isn't true. Also, I agree. Look, the Bible is very explicit on this. If you look at the Old Testament, it says in Leviticus, "You are not to sleep with a man as with a woman; it is detestable." And when they mean sleeping, they don't just mean, sleeping in the same bed. Should be kind of explicit. Obvious. You are not to have sexual intercourse with any animal, defiling yourself with it. A woman is not to present herself to an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion. Do not you defile yourself by any of these practices, for the nations I am driving you out before you have defiled themselves by all these things. Now, again, some people will try to be like, oh, well, that's the Old Testament. That doesn't matter. All that matters is the New Testament. And then you look at the New Testament, and Paul says the same thing. Romans 1:26-27. For this reason, God delivered them over to disgraceful passions. Their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. This is a very fancy way of saying the women were sleeping together instead of sleeping with men. That is what Paul means by natural versus unnatural, which you find in the philosophy of the Greeks and Romans. Mainly Aristotle, who talked about natural versus unnatural practices. I believe it was Aristotle. I hope I'm not grabbing the wrong ancient philosopher out of the back of my head. The men, in the same way, also left natural relations with women and were inflamed in their lust for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the appropriate penalty of their error. And then in 1 Corinthians 6:9-11, don't you know that the unrighteous will not inherit God's kingdom? Do not be deceived. No sexually immoral person, idolaters, adulterers, or males who have sex with males, no thieves, greedy people, drunkards, verbally abusive people, or swindlers will inherit God's kingdom. And some of you used to be like this, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. Again, the Bible could not be more clear. Now, I have seen some progressive writers who try to be like, well, they basically try to pull, which every heresy tries to pull, which is Paul is not a legit apostle, or what Paul wrote was just his opinion. No, it wasn't. Paul, at every single junction, is justifying, hey, the other apostles have justified me. They're saying I'm legit. Here's why I'm legit. Blah. Here's what I'm saying. And if we look at all the early church fathers, they all agree with this. This is not up for debate. So what they would say, CBGBs, is that imagine, okay, so you have to go back in time, right? So at the time, there is no Bible. There's just manuscripts going all over the place, okay? So you have people writing letters, going this way and that way. You have some counterfeits that are going on. You mainly get this in the late 2nd century, so think post 200. Oh, wait, no, that'd be the 3rd century. Sorry, yeah, mainly 3rd century. You see a lot of it. You do see, I think, the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Thomas. One of the infant Gospels is in the 2nd century, but the rest are usually pretty later on. And so what they basically say is Paul is one of these fake ones that he got thrown in when he wasn't supposed to be. They basically care about, or what they'll do is they'll say, only. Now, this argument is at least slightly more legit, which is what they'll say is if we look in the Old Testament, right, you do have writings in there that are descriptive. So you have people like Moses and stuff who will say, do this and that. And it's like, did God say that? No, he didn't. Okay, well, so that's Moses just saying stuff and being wrong. You actually get this with, Inspiring Philosophy makes the case that you get this with Moses and one of the wars that's raged against one of the groups in the area. I can't remember which, in which he says that there's an instance there where Moses is telling the men to do something which God did not tell him to do. I can't remember what. It's been a while. Yeah, I think you're right, Hopping a Writer. I should know because I literally watched Mike Winger read the whole thing like 2 weeks ago. And I watched Winnigan's video on it. Wild stuff. Definitely not legit. Yeah, you're right, GG's. Paul derails a lot of modern stuff. Paul would have been angry at us. No, definitely no 2 cents about it. 2 ways about it. But yeah, I think that's why a lot of people try to discount it. What Paul does. Now, so for our last slide of the night, before we call it, I have sort of like 3 common arguments I heard of. Yeah, if you got rid of Paul, I mean, it would shrink the New Testament like by half. Yeah. Now, you still keep a lot of doctrine. In fact, here's what I'll say. I think you get rid of Paul, you actually still don't solve this issue. Because even if you get rid of Paul, you can't get rid of the fact that Jesus, when he's talking about marriage, is very explicit about, hey, Genesis 1. Or not Genesis 1, Genesis 2. In the beginning, go, boom, there. Look at that marriage. That is how it's supposed to be. And so there's no way you get around this at all. So that, I hate that argument so much. Right, Hopping a Writer. It's so ridiculous. It's the equivalent of the people who are like, well, the Bible never uses the word Trinity. So, obviously, the Trinity was, insert made up by, what's the guy that converted?
Council of Nicaea.
Yeah, Nicaea. It all got done in Nicaea. And also, again, what I find so hilarious is these people would try to act like Rome was this weird gay haven in which everyone was gay. Somehow society lived on, but everyone was gay, right? And then at the same breath, they'll be like, "But Paul, he was dumb. He couldn't possibly have a idea of what a homosexual is." And it's like, you can't have both these things be true. Like, it's talked about in the Old Testament, which, if depending on how you date the Old Testament, how many thousands of years back, hundreds, whatever you want to do. Like, if they're talking about it back then, Paul, who's well versed in it, is obviously going to understand what it is in the modern era. It's not like these people just came into existence 5 seconds ago. It's ridiculous. People act like everyone born before the 2000s was an absolute buffoon who was so mind-numbingly stupid they could have no concept of this, which is just utterly ridiculous. And again, even if you don't have a word that's like explicitly like homosexual, if you have one that's like, hey, if you go to the not the Greek, the Roman, whatever, and it's like, hey, don't have natural relations with the same sex. Don't trade that, don't trade natural relations with unnatural relations. And then you look at the historical context, you go to the culture, and it's like, oh, what's this meaning? Oh, it meant this. Well, duh, you just solved the issue. Like, it's so silly. It's goofy, it's lazy, and if you're gonna try to say the entire church has misunderstood something for 2,000 years, you're gonna need better evidence than that. The word that I would prefer used is not in it. Sorry, argument of silence doesn't work. Don't do that. Exactly. Paul would have been considered one of the most educated people of the time, by far. No question about that. He was high up in the Jewish council. That would have meant he would have had what would have been considered a high education, especially for the era. And if it even wasn't, it's so funny to me. People act like, oh, well, these people were illiterate, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, they were illiterate. That didn't mean they couldn't have any concept of anything. It's not like they were like 5-year-olds. It's so stupid. Whatever, I'm getting too off point. But anyways, so when we look at this, mainly when it comes to homosexuality, you have 3 big arguments that are used on it. At least in sort of like the commonplace, us talking to each other, nonchalant. Obviously there's more, but you get these 3, right? Okay, so I want us to look at these arguments and then discuss, hey, how do these arguments fail? So for the first argument, we have the love is love. Now, ignoring the fact that that's just defining a word with itself, let's actually look at what the argument is. Try to steel man it, and by steel manning it, then dealing with that argument as best we can. Quote, so the argument for this would be like, this view emphasizes that love between consenting adults, regardless of gender, should not be restricted. Many argue that feelings of love and attraction are natural and should not be subjected to religious doctrine. So that's a good question, jalapeno writer. In fact, that's a fantastic question. And also, you're pulling off those tactics. Great job. Fantastic job. I'm glad you remember them. So, what would you guys say are... So let's say, let's say we're not going to get an argument like, oh, what is love? Which, although I actually love that, that's a good way to approach it. Let's just say we grant them that our definitions of love are kind of the same. It actually suffers from some internal critiques. So what would be some of those? If anyone has any ideas. There's one that like blares out to me very strongly. So when we look at the argument, what would you say is one way in which it fails? Like, what's something it's saying that the person saying it probably doesn't want to be true, actually? Like, there's a really strong moral error in the argument, besides the fact that it's saying that homosexuality is fine, when it's not. Be fair, I might not be posing this question very good. How about this? So someone says this argument to you. How would you respond? Like, what's a counter argument or question you could ask to rebut this? Besides the, what is love? Which is a great question, actually, which I didn't think of. I'll give it a couple minutes. Do you have one, Mikey? I'm gonna start calling on people in the class.
Do you have a problem with this argument?
Yeah, what would you say is like a good counter argument to this? Or like a question you could have, something you could point out, like some flaw logically, or what?
Why do you think that love is the most important thing?
That's definitely one way you could go. Because that's definitely like a presupposed quality.
Yeah, right. Like
No,
love
sorry.
is not like the reason for. I mean, God is love, so yes, love is the reason, right? But like, our morality isn't based on love.
Yeah, I was gonna say I could
On
imagine
God.
someone maybe trying to counter and say, well, isn't love a good quality? So shouldn't we be trying to like increase love? Trying to work our way towards perfection, so this would be sort of like almost trying to argue against yourself.
Yeah.
I think there's one big argument you can make that actually doesn't. That's a good way. Next thing you keep off thought, right? You could go straight to the foundation. You'd be like, you know what? I'm not even gonna really deal with it. Let's actually get deeper. Okay, so you're saying this is a moral truth, like you're making a moral truth claim here. Well, where are we grounding moral truth claims? And in that case, you could bring up the argument from objective morality, which I do think that's a great route to go. And if I'm asked this question, sometimes I'll go that way. No, with this specific one, I would do that with the other ones, but for this specific one, actually, I think here's how I would personally approach it. And again, I'm not the guru of you must approach it this way. But one blatant argument that comes to me is, okay, why should it not, which is actually kind of going your way, asking about why shouldn't it be restricted this way? And why should we then limit it by these criteria, right? So let's look at it. We're limiting by, it has to be consenting adults. Why? It can be regarded as gender. Why?
Right.
Saying like, because if your argument is, let's look at further down, right? Because this is so important. Actually, oops, I gotta bring out the pen. I forget that you guys can't actually see my mouse. So if we go down here, right? Many argue that feelings of love and attraction are natural and should not be subjected to religious doctrine. Okay, so what's the actual argument being made? Saying, okay, this is true. So it's kind of presupposing this, right? This is true. And the reason why this is true is because feelings of love and attraction are natural. Okay. So one thing you've noticed with a lot of people, right, they'll try to argue about, is there a gay gene? Is there not a gay gene? Who cares? Okay, want to make arguments, whatever. The argument that something is moral because it's natural is entirely flawed.
Yeah.
Why? Because there's a lot of natural things that you don't actually want to be. You don't want things done. Yes, entirely. Rape is natural. Incest is natural. Pedophilia is entirely natural, depending on the animal. Murder is natural. Maybe monkeys won't murder people in their own, or not people, but other monkeys in their tribe, but they'll happily go to war and murder other monkeys. So if you're trying to argue that, because something is natural, therefore it's okay. Well, I can give you a whole list of other natural feelings that aren't okay. So why is it okay in this regard and not okay in this regard? Now, what some people will try to do is they'll try to go with the consent. Well, what separates is consent. Okay. Well, here's my next question. Is it possible for someone to consent to a moral evil? Whoa. Now, that's a pretty hot topic in today's society because honestly, you have a lot of people who would flat out say, no, you can't. But of course, if you think that, I can just come up with 1,000,000,001 scenarios in which that's not true, right? And by the way, how do you even define consent? Like, this is also a big question. That's why you have there's so many debates around consent and why consent has become such a weird thing in modern society. Because people have made it the groundwork for all moral decision making, like consent or not consent, like that's dictates everything morally. You then end up in these situations where people recognize the moral evil, but because they can't say like, oh well, sure they consented to a moral evil, they then try to deny consent. So, for example, during the Me Too movement, there was a lot of talks about, hey, that these people, you couldn't actually consent. So people were retroactively removing consent. They're like, oh well, they regretted it later. Well, this guy is, maybe theoretically a little higher up on the hierarchy, maybe he's a little stronger or something. So what, she was just intimidated, and sure she said yes, but actually she didn't. Now, if you look at it objectively speaking, you just can't get around it. It's like if someone says yes, sorry to break it to you, yes, they did. They did consent. Outside of like a handful of scenarios, yes, they did. They consented to something that they then regretted. But because in modern society we've based morality around that single topic, we then have to retroactively come up with excuses for why that actually isn't true. Because it turns out we can recognize objective moral evils even if we try to deny them. Or try to work our way around them. So anyways, yeah, so and yeah, as you were sampling, like you have kids. And by the way, when on the third week, I'll be going pretty deep into the queer theory and stuff. And some of the very explicitly pedophilic issues that arise from it. Yeah, I'll be really going deep into that on the third week. And obviously working through the justifications, talking about it, and why that is the case. Mainly I'm kind of just giving you guys a little teaser. Yeah, helping you right. That's literally statistic. I've had people tell me that statistic literally in college. And I have to take so many stupid not classes, but like I have to go through these stupid web seminars about it. And they're so stupid. It's like if you make a bad joke, it's like, oh, well, that's basically the same as sexual assault. And it's like, no, it's not, actually. That's pretty insulting. Don't do that. Never mind the weirdness about, oh, what if you have two people drunk? And it's like, oh, well, we'll just kind of arbitrarily choose who we think was wrong. It's like, they're both drunk. What do you mean? I don't know. Maybe you should just not get drunk with random people you don't know. I don't know. Call me crazy again. Yeah, it is. And yeah, it's just the whole thing's stupid. But again, because you've made consent the only moral standard, you have to come up with these ridiculous double standards in order to try to make it work. But either way, again, I think these are just some sort of stuff to talk when talking about this argument. And some rebuttals, I think, that work very well with it. Now, the second argument you have is separation of church and state. Here's the argument. Critics often argue that religious beliefs, including views on homosexuality, should not influence secular laws or policies. They assert that everyone should be free to live according to their own beliefs, especially in a pluralistic society. Now, this one actually commits a logical fallacy that I believe both Hopping Right and Mexican Thought, I believe you're there for this. This commits a fallacy that I actually talked about way back in the fall. You guys happen to remember which one that might be? Besides it just being a presupposition. Which I guess technically is not a logical fallacy actually in itself.
Which one are you talking about?
The separation of church and state. So, and you can see the argument right here, like more fleshed out. So that way, we
Yeah.
have sort of the catchphrase for it, and then now we have the actual argument. And I kind of just use ChatGPT to come up with these arguments. And actually, I think it did a pretty good job, at least giving like what I've heard and formalizing it a little better, without going straight up like P1, P2 type stuff.
Okay, well, some people can have really terrible beliefs.
Yeah.
Like, you wouldn't allow somebody who thinks that non-white people should be killed. You wouldn't say, oh, well, they should be allowed to live according to their beliefs. So why would you say it? Why would you allow these people to think that?
Yeah, and I think going off of what you're saying, and hopping, you keep writing. It's you stop. Okay, there he goes. The big one with stuff like that is these are things secular people have believed too. Like oftentimes it's like, oh, only religious people have had bad ideas. The secularists, the great moral arbiters of truth and stuff, they came in with like right standard that they just magically came up with. It's like, well, no, look, we have Stalin. We can look at this stuff. We can look at Singer and Planned Parenthood. We can look at these things, and they believe awful stuff. Just because you're secular doesn't mean you believe great things. So, I think you figured it out. So, what the logical fallacy is called begging the question. You're just saying, oh, well, only secular people can talk about morality and stuff. Only secular people can argue about this. Why? Because religious people shouldn't have an opinion on it. Or not that they shouldn't have an opinion on it, but that their opinion is purely private and should not go out into the world. And again, we'll actually talk about this when we start talking about two-tiered systems in the two-storied systems in the next week, the next sort of episode of this. A religious worldview, just like any other worldview, is making truth claims about the world. And so as people making truth claims about the world, you cannot just say, oh, well, because you're religious, you can't have a say. That's ridiculous. Just like how I couldn't say, oh, well, you're an atheist, so you can't have an opinion. That's dumb. People can make arguments regardless of worldview, and now we can judge them. And if you want to say, oh, well, you're being inconsistent within your worldview, okay, we can talk about that. But that's not the same thing. You don't just get to arbitrarily be like, nah, your worldview is this, and so argument negated. You can't just do that. That's just straight up a logical fallacy. And then beyond that, the idea of separating of church and state, historically speaking, is incredibly misunderstood. The idea that when the U.S. government, specifically the U.S. government, obviously I can't talk about other governments because I'm not very familiar with them, comes to the U.S. government, is incredibly explicit in its religiosity when you look at all its founding documents. There's no two ways about it. Now, in recent history, people have tried to turn every single founding father into like a deist or something, which is factually inaccurate. Straight up, there were a couple deists, but the idea that every single person, including Thomas Jefferson, he likes to get thrown in when he shouldn't be either, that they were all just these like semi-deists. And to sort of explain what a deist is, the idea of deism is that God made the universe and everything, but then he doesn't actually act on it. He sort of just, made the system and then he just doesn't do anything. And the idea that was going on is not true. The founding fathers, for the most part, were hyper Christians. They absolutely were Christian. They believed the Bible and all this stuff. And when they're talking about God, guess what? They are talking about the Christian God. They're not just talking about some random deity in the sky. And then beyond that, when we look at, okay, where does the term separating the church and state come from? Because the only instances you find it is in the First Amendment and also from Thomas Jefferson. And in both instances, what you see is that what's going on is, what it's saying is that the government shouldn't make a church like the Church of England, for example, and then dictate which churches are allowed and which aren't. What it didn't mean is that people with religious opinions should not have a say in the government. That's completely ridiculous. Yeah. Yes, Thomas Paine was a staunch deist. There was, I think there was one more. I remember watching an entire series done by a guy who has the largest private collection of American artifacts from the Revolutionary War, or not Revolutionary War, but from like the founding fathers and stuff. And he was talking about it, and it was pretty interesting. But again, to be fair, that argument is more just a clarification of being like, hey, you don't actually, historically speaking, politically, you're wrong about this. This isn't true about America. But I think the actual argument would be to go into like, hey, this is just begging the question, why shouldn't I have a say? Blah, blah. Again, you don't just get the presuppose, well, secularism true, therefore only secular people can argue about it. Now, the last one, and Amelia, this kind of goes on with what I was saying in the beginning, is the appeal to science and nature. And here's the argument. Some counter-arguments suggest that homosexuality is a natural variation in human sexuality and may even have a genetic basis, therefore something is natural should be accepted. Again, as we talked about earlier, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's okay. Literally all moral systems, all of them, every single one, at least all, I'll take this back. There's a couple that don't, but the vast majority of them, the whole point of a moral system is that people want to naturally do things and you have to tell them no. If your moral system was just that whatever you felt like you could just do, which is, I guess, technically hedonism in a way. Now, obviously, they would argue about it and try to make it a little bit more strict than that. But the whole point of a system like that, primarily, is that people would do otherwise. Or else, why would you have to tell people not to? Oh, yeah. There's so many problems with it. It's a goofy argument, logically flawed. Don't do it. It's dumb. It's a dumb argument. If you want to argue about it, give actual arguments, not that. Oh, well, if I can find you a clownfish, that, you know, how, because that's one sometimes you get with the transgender people, right? With in case you don't know, clownfishes, they can actually like switch their sexes, seemingly almost at will. It's weird. I don't fully understand it. Other people like that. It's like, yes, clownfishes aren't people. That's a big one. And also, again, if we're going the argument that I can find you an animal that does something, therefore it's natural, I'm sorry to break it to you. I love dolphins, but we would be throwing them on the electric chair. If people behave like dolphins, there would be mass executions. I'm trying my best not to do the turning the friggin' frogs gay. Cause that every time I see frogs, that's all I can think about. I just think it's even more hilarious that was actually true. Frogs were literally becoming gayer at faster rates because of some bizarro chemicals that were spewing out of this plant. But anyways, on topics that are related. Yeah, so any questions, thoughts on this slide or any of the previous slides? Oh, Alex Jones. That man there's a lot of glorious memes that have come from that man. I think my favorite one is when he's on Joe Rogan and he's like, Joe, I'm kind of retarded.
He's really, really smart, and he's really, really funny. There's a lot of good memes of him in like the Warhammer stuff.
Oh, he's textbook perfect for Warhammer.
Have you seen the Warhammer memes? They're so good.
Oh yeah, I've seen all of them. There's also a really funny one with him and Jordan Peterson. Warhammer one, no, when Jordan's going off on this random topic. It's pretty funny. Oh man, some glorious memes, some whack opinions, but Some good memes. But anyways, are there any questions about anything else besides Alex Jones? Oh. Okay, so I think we'll call it for today. So next week, we are going to be covering the book Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey and going over, I think she mainly talks about mind-body dualism and how modern versions of it distort the human body and how that then leads to a lot of sexual issues. So we'll be talking about that next week. And then the week following that, I'm making my way through the books. And by the way, I'll if you guys want, I'll just post like book lists on anything I talk about. So that way if you're like, hey, I want to learn more about this, you have resources and stuff. And to be fair, you can also just DM me. Yeah, so the third week will be coming LGBTQ stuff and mainly the origins of the movements, how they behave, and how we can try to counteract them. And the two books I'll be using for that are a lot of the stuff's gonna be coming from is gonna be The Queering of the American Child by Logan Lansing with James Lindsay, and The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by, is it A.R. Truman?
Yeah,
Whatever.
Truman.
I forget the first two letters of his name.
Carl.
Ah, okay, thanks. Yeah, so those will be the two books I'll be using for that. Besides that, so I'm gonna probably do the same time next week, unless anyone has any issues, and then we can just move it if need be. But besides that, thank you all for coming. Spending way longer than I thought I was, but I guess that happens every time, so I guess it's just to be expected.